Welcome to the Climate Anticipation Podcast. Welcome, everybody, to the Climate Anticipation Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Christopher Fici, and once again here from my treehouse studio in New Rochelle, New York, enjoying a beautiful day. It's watching the flowers bloom on the trees. It's I would say it's a little bit nicer than living in New York City sometimes, was where I used to live, but I am really blessed to be with one of my dear friends, colleagues, and mentors, Reverend Fletcher Harper, today as the executive director of Green Faith. Fletcher, thank you so much. I've been friends with you, colleagues, and as a mentor, been a mentor for me for many years now, going back to the middle of last decade, did the Green Faith Fellowship, which was really one of the most formative experiences. I like to really, I remember the first time I met you was you came to a class on ecofeminism and earth spirituality, taught by one of my also dear mentors, Professor Chung Hyun Kyung at Union Theological Seminary, and you introduced Green Faith. And that was, for me, actually the moment where I look back and say, yes, eco-theology is what I want to do. Because I was coming into Union, and you're another Union alum, not quite knowing where I wanted to go, which I think is standard for people who come into Union. And of course, Union then turns you upside down, and you come out the other side in many different ways. But that, I was thinking ecology or interfaith, and I ended up doing both things, but especially ecology. And when I met you, that was actually a key moment on the pathway. So for folks who are listening now, some who are certainly aware of Green Faith, but some who are not, I'd love for you to share just kind of the vision behind Green Faith and what it really means to bring just so many religious people together, leaders, and give them the capacities and the skills to do the great work, as Thomas Berry says. Like, what is the real vision behind Green Faith?
Well, first of all, Dr. Fici, it sounds good. It's good. It's great to see you. So, there are several sort of streams of energy that come together around what Green Faith is. The first thing is just this deep sense that there is something that could not be more profoundly spiritual and moral than our relationship to the natural world. And a recognition of that sort of on the positive side of the equation, that the natural world in this postmodern age we live in is the closest thing to a universal religious, spiritual reality that we've got. We were talking just a minute ago about the sort of raw awe phrase and the fact that it's just, it's across religions, across ethnicities, across nationalities, across income levels. There is this really deep sense of amazement. The old Heschel phrase about radical amazement. So that's. But then there's also a very, very strong moral piece of the picture, which is looking at what sort of consumer capitalist economy, neoliberal economic reality, how that has literally hollowed out and desecrated the planet, treated people by the millions as disposable, particularly black and brown people, women, people living in the 2/3 world, and just the sort of absolute moral outrage that needs to be evoking from religious and spiritual people of all stripes. So that's sort of one stream that makes up Green Faith, is that kind of stance. I think a second piece that's been clear from the start is an interfaith strand. We are really proudly interfaith, and I would say on the religious progressive end of the interfaith spectrum. We think that religion is at an existential crossroads, that the older, quote unquote, traditional do it because our parents did it forms, if they're not broken down entirely, they're getting very close to that. And it just will not work that way. And religion sort of stands at this, there's a fork in the road where you've got very, very destructive forms of fundamentalist, nationalist, extremist religion expressions whether in the US it's evangelical Christianity, in Brazil Pentecostal Christianity, Hindu nationalism, Hindutva in the Indian subcontinent, and there are other examples in different places. So and those, those expressions of religion bring together, broadly speaking, a pro-corporate, anti-cultural and religious and ethnic racial minority, anti-environment stance wherever they manifest themselves, as well as a highly exclusionary approach to religion. Or you take an interfaith perspective, which recognizes that there is this storehouse of transformative richness religiously and spiritually amongst the different traditions, that we need to be open to learning from that, even as we practice our own tradition or our own sort of new way of being religious, moral, spiritual in the world. So that's the second piece is, there's a sort of eco spiritual stance, there's an interfaith stance. And I think the third thing is around community and activist religious community life. The idea that what it means to be a religious person is to be on the move, activism wise, and to be organizing and building moral power, to make a difference in the world, to make a difference in our own lives, our own local communities, and in the world. Those are the three things I think that together make up what Green Faith is about.
I've come to appreciate, especially over the past few years, especially teaching Laudato Si to my students at Iona College and talking about integral ecology. And that is something I continuously harp on as one of the main themes of how we understand those connections between religion and the natural world. The social ecology, our natural ecology. And I think sometimes I add a little like the inner ecology element to that as well. And also I remembered when I was doing the Green Faith Fellowship and we visited communities in New Jersey dealing with environmental justice issues. And that really, when I was reading, ended up studying something like Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor by Leonardo Boff, which was a big influence on me. Really appreciating the directions the fellowship gave me to make those environmental justice connections to what you're trying to do, as what we're all trying to do as religious leaders. It's an indispensable element. In fact, it's really the core of properly practiced religion, is that justice making.
No, and I think that those, it's weird. I mean, it's, as we said in the fellowship program, very few people go to visit pollution on purpose. And so, and yet it surrounds us. And for some people, it's a death threat. And we have not, as people, let alone religious people, we largely have only just begun to appreciate on that kind of deep cultural, beyond rational level, what a threat different forms of pollution poses. And so the issue is that we need to see that stuff so that we can wake up to it. And that's really key.
One of the things that we're trying to do with this project and this podcast is to make an argument for the importance of religion in theology towards responding to our climate emergency, amongst many other things. And religion and theology gets a bad name sometimes in general, but also especially when talking about our climate emergency. I've been doing a lot of work with our mutual friend and colleague, Sarah Jelena Wolcott, on the doctrine of discovery. I actually had her come in and talk about that with my students at Iona. But it's something I'm always struggling with, because religion is, as you were saying, religion can go in many different directions, directions which are conducive towards responding to our climate emergency, and things that are not conducive. For someone who is suspicious of religion and theology, how would you help them to understand both the importance of the values across different traditions to live well on earth, but also the fact that we need to confront some of the stuff that religion has done and continues to do? How do we hold kind of the light and the darkness of religion in doing this work, which is, I know, is a big, gigantic question, but
I think the main thing is just to keep it real. I mean, I think that the biggest danger for religion is to sort of play the mystification game, that like you can't talk about it. So if you see, Christianity used for white nationalist, racist, violent purposes, like it was in the storming of the Capitol, in DC back in January, you got to call a spade a spade. I mean, it's, that's an abuse of religion, and it's appalling. So I think that this is where I think one of the tactical and strategic mistakes that the religious environmental movement has made, to be honest, is not to be more critical of expressions of religion that essentially say God's plan is to burn the planet up.
Right.
And so we should just go for it, and the oil and gas industry is great. I mean, that's just it's a disgustingly appalling theology, misplaced hope that playing nice and kind with and sounding moderate will bring folks over. I just think that's been a strategy that shows no evidence of having worked. And so I think the question that we got to do is put to these religious extremists: are you really in favor of destroying the planet, displacing hundreds of millions of people from their homes, and being responsible for tens of millions of premature deaths? Is that your idea of what God is about? And just put it directly like that. I mean, that's so I think the best way to keep religion honest is to interrogate it and to hold it accountable to the same kind of standards that any other human enterprise ought to get held accountable to.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, and I always wanted to have this conversation with you. We both come from Union Theological Seminary backgrounds, and I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit about your own kind of theological journey or eco-theological journey, both that brought you to do this very wonderful work of helping to organize Green Faith, what brought you there, but also what feeds you now, because I just think I really want to highlight as many voices as we can highlight in terms of those that influence us, and showing these networks, as I'm kind of calling it, these networks of anticipation, which bring us forward. But you were at Union, you graduated, I think, in the early 90s, right? You finished. And so I think we did have probably some common professors like James Cone and Hyun Kyung and Larry Rasmussen. I'm just curious to hear what theologically brought you to this work, and what continues to.
I mean, there are definitely through lines. I mean, I came to Union as a sort of scared, fairly young, privileged white kid. I came to Union because I got the sense that it was serious about digging in on really deep issues, and unapologetically, and being willing to turn things upside down for the sake of figuring out what was really most important. And that's part of that has been a chunk of what still motivates me and moves me, and gives me a sense of hope, and not so much of hope, but gives me like a sense of why it's worth continuing to fight, because I think that there's a way in which, to me, that's what makes religion worthwhile, is does it have the guts to dig really deep? Does it have the guts to bring the fullness of who we are, our hearts, our minds, and really to go to work on that. So I think that's to me, that's a key piece of the picture. I think, in terms of, I mean, I'm in my late 50s now. What motivates me is, for me, one of the most reliable spiritual motivators has been anger. I don't know that I would have said that 15, 20 years ago, but it's true now. I think that when people lose a sense of outrage, they stop being as alive as they need to be. And God knows that there's a lot that's wrong in the world. So I think those are but to be honest, also, I find often that organized religious institutions don't really have a strong tolerance for that brand of being religious. They function much more like sort of chaplaincy outfits to try to keep people calm and happy, and they don't necessarily have a full stake in the revolution, so to speak. So I think that I think that anybody who gets too comfortable with the status quo of religious institutions, I think that's a dangerous thing.
Yeah. This is something, what you said about anger, I think is so important, because when I think about those teachers, those theologians which have influenced me, and James Cone comes first to mind. And he was so infused with the spirit of James Baldwin as well. And of course, one of the best experiences I had at Union was auditing his Baldwin seminar that he offered. But what I learned from both of them, from Dr. Cone and from James Baldwin, is that anger is essential, and it's essential that your anger is rooted in a sense of love for another, or even some kind of love for even the people that you're angry with. Like, that love has to fuel that anger. But how do anger, love, hope are very strong emotions that are sometimes not always conducive for change. From your own experience, how do you, like, your sense of anger and outrage has drive this work? How do you root that in care and compassion and love, and these values, which sometimes can seem opposite to anger, but I feel like has to infuse the outrage that we have?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that, I hear that from folks. Well, I guess what I would say is that I think until one is, pretty deeply disturbed by things that are wrong,
Yeah.
one doesn't really have a capacity to love. Or that, maybe to frame that another way, the capacity to be deeply upset about things that are wrong represents
Yeah.
is indispensable to being loving. So I guess I just don't, I'm not a rageaholic, so it's like, and I'm not advocating for that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to have a sense of humor, and,
Yeah.
to be able to speak tenderly as well as forcefully.
Yeah.
I just don't think that the two things should be, I think that too often the two things get posed as being polarized, when I think the dynamic is a lot tighter than that.
Yeah. Going back to when I first met you, we were talking about raw awe earlier. I know you've written about this in your book, Green Faith, and something that you share quite a bit with people. And I talk about this with my students quite a bit, because students I have who are undergraduates at Iona, I'm always trying to kind of cultivate in them a sense of intimacy with the natural world. Something Thomas Berry mentions in the great work, Our Destiny Lies in Our Capacity for Intimacy. First of all, could you explain what raw awe is? Because it's just like a great concept. It's a great experience. And how can that help us to really feel more rooted and connected in being proper citizens of Earth, proper human beings, proper lovers of this planet, and where we can go?
I think that, this is getting, more theological than I normally do, but I would say, I'm a believer that religion and the the core essence of who we are as people starts with something that really blows us away,
Mm-hmm.
something that really amazes us. And with that sense of, it's the radical amazement, awe language that I think is so much at the heart of what, whether it's when a Muslim submits to Allah,
Yeah.
and the power and the majesty and the beauty and the tenderness and the awesomeness of Allah, or when a Hindu is caught up in the rapture of of worship and devotion, or and I could go on and on. I think that, to me, that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about awe. It's sort of the original out of body experience.
Yeah.
And so I think that there are three basic places where people get that experience.
Mm-hmm.
One is that people have experiences that, for example, a Christian would call a born again experience, that represent an intimate sense of union and connection with God, as manifest through an established religious spiritual tradition. So I think that's one place where it comes, being saved by the love of Jesus. A second place where people get it, I think, is when they fall totally head over heels in love with a beloved person. And they experience it there, and it just takes them way far beyond and outside of themselves. And at the same time, they find themselves more deeply than ever before.
Yeah.
And I think the third place is in relationship to the natural world, where we know because of our research that, and just listening to people tell their stories, that people have these experiences of awe and wonder and gratitude and humility and amazement and fear and rapture in relationship to the natural world in different ways. And that, I think, is the closest thing that I can say to what we mean by this kind of raw awe, that's the indispensable raw material that we all are gifted to work with in terms of our own core identity and our deepest religious and spiritual selves. And those are and the natural world is, without question, one of the few places where that energy shows up consistently and repeatedly for people across all religions and cultures. So I don't know if that helps, but that's what we think about. I mean, it's just something that's absolutely fundamental.
Yeah. No, as I was, working on my own on this project and trying to, figure out what anticipation means in terms of this whole concept of anticipatory community, and which you've gleaned from Larry Rasmussen. And I very much consider Green Faith a very good example of an anticipatory community, especially in relation to our ecology and and the climate emergency. But what is that practice of anticipation? And you touched upon the three things that it feels like. It can feel like a religious experience. It can feel like a romantical experience. It can also feel like a natural experience. And those things can often find themselves in types of creative combination, but it's like that anticipation is that energy or that desire which pulls us forward. And that can be religious, that can be in a relationship, and that can be in a type of experience with the natural world. So I just like that energy that pulls us forward, I think, is at the core of the work we have to do together. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing perhaps an experience of raw awe that has been really formative for you.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a bunch, and just to go way back, because I think these experiences hit people sometimes at a very early age. I mean, I remember distinctly being in Rhode Island at and I don't think I was older than 6, 7, 8 years old, and just having a moment running outside in bare feet, and it was foggy, and feeling the texture of the ground underneath my feet, and then my foot hit a rock, and it was, it hurt a little bit, but the rock there was a coldness to the rock, and there was just, sort of in that moment, just this big fullness of presence that I felt and experienced, where it was like things just stopped, and I just felt it in a really full and big way. And what I've always appreciated about that memory is that it's an entirely sort of unspectacular thing. I was a kid running around outside barefoot, but I find that that's what the deal is with these experiences, is that they hit people, they overtake people, in the midst of just normal everyday life. And all of a sudden it's boom, it's right there. And I think that kind of infusion of reality is That's what a spiritual or religious experience is for people wherever it happens.
Yeah.
And again, for me, that was one of those places. And look, I mean, I'm 58, so look, here 50 years later, I feel like I can remember it
Yeah.
with a vividness that is,
Yeah.
really a gift.
Yeah.
And really still has power. And that's quite something.
Yeah. I mean, when I was younger, I had a similar experience, probably around the same age, the first time I saw the Great Lakes in Michigan. And I specifically remember like running towards the lake going, it's the ocean, it's the ocean, it's the ocean, just being like overwhelmed by this big blue body of water. And I still am every year when we go, my family goes and spends some time on Lake Huron. It's just, I think about this raw awe quite a bit, but I also think about the fact that awe should bring us into intimacy. The being overwhelmed or being touched in this way ultimately roots us, ultimately brings us into more intimate relations. So for me, the Great Lakes is still this very overwhelming type of thing to experience. But then when you swim in her and experience the water, it's very intimate. And I think that kind of cultivating those experiences for more and more people, both the sense of the awe and the grandeur of creation, but then also those intimate parts of it as well.
I think that is really important. And I'm also very mindful, for years we've done, talked with people about their experiences outdoors.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it is important to recognize that there's a considerable amount of privilege tied up in a number of the stories that, my story was on a time of vacation, and there are, the majority of the world can't afford that.
Yeah.
And we know that those things are there. We also know, I've heard people talk about very painful memories of feeling a sense of lack of self-worth because the environment within which they live is profoundly littered in one way or another. And so I think it's just important to, we used to focus very much on those stories as being instrumental, but I've found over time that it's equally important to encourage people to think about the moment when they felt activated to care and to move from passivity into action. Because I think those moments of empowerment really matter also, when people for the first time realize, I'm not willing to let the status quo stand, and I'm going to get up and do something about it. And I am not going to back down or stay silent. So I think that it's really important to, and those are moments of raw awe too. When something deep inside of us says, I matter, and I can make a difference, and I am going to stand up. So I think that's, I think that too much eco-theology only takes on the first sort of awe of the natural world dimension of things, and neglects the activation story as an incredibly important part of our spiritual lives also.
No, I really appreciate that, because conversations I've been having, this conversation as an example, but others talking about the evolution of this whole experience of eco-theology, as it's kind of, there's the fields of religion and ecology, and people study this in the academy. And then the scholar Jay McDaniel talks about people as everyday eco-theologians putting this into practice in a way that might not be considered like academic, but actually is. And I always say the people who are doing the real eco-theology are the ones who care for the land and are doing like that particular work. But this component of how our grief can activate us, how our sense of injustice can activate us, how we carry those feelings forward. That's something in your work with Green Faith and your work with all of us who are working as trying to be leaders in our communities, in our own contexts. How do we process that grief properly? Because hope doesn't sound right. turn on the news for 15 seconds, you're going to feel pretty hopeless, right? Just turning on the news feels hopeless. How do we, if it's not hope, and if it's not certainty, because there's also distinct lack of certainty in many ways, how do we use these energies of grief to help activate us and pull us forward? How is that part of Green Faith's work with people?
So it's a really good question, and I've got, I'm sort of two minds about the grief piece of the picture. I think that there is a dimension to it that represents something of a luxury, because to be able to take time to talk about eco grief means that you've got a lot of basic needs taken care of.
Right.
That doesn't mean that it's wrong in any sense, but there's a class dimension to that I think it's important to acknowledge. And I have always, as someone who, as I said earlier in our conversation, has found anger more activating, have concerns about the sort of eco grief recognition serving as a something that does not necessarily activate. Now, on the other hand, and this is going to fully contradict what I've just said, I think if one isn't struck by a sense of tragedy and grief and loss around what we're doing to the planet, then you got to screw loose. I mean, it's very difficult to fathom that we've pumped enough CO2 or whatever up into the atmosphere to start changing the temperature and to break the weather patterns that have sustained life for millennia. That's sobering.
Yeah.
And so I think that, like I said, I feel of two minds about this, and that I haven't, quite got those two things integrated within myself, except that I know that I feel both of them pretty strongly.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that too. And I think that's one of the reasons I asked this question, is because in wrestling with my own grief, or even just trying to feel it, to be honest with you, it's always about this, not trying to get stuck there. And I hear that grief can be a luxury, right? And there's always that temptation to wallow in that. I was just hearing something Robin Wall Kimmerer was talking about, kind of green complacency. And one aspect of green complacency is just thinking, okay, I recycle, I eat Beyond Burgers, I compost, and that's enough. That does not lead us to the systemic work that's very much at the core of Green Faith, but there's also just that sense of giving up. And it's how do we hold that feeling of giving up in itself is kind of sacred too. Like I sometimes think about like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, just kind of like feel like ready to give up. But it may be sacred to feel those feelings, but it's not necessarily so to just surrender to those feelings and again, you're saying have the privilege to surrender to those feelings. So I appreciate that, because it's such a complex experience, grief, and there's so many ways to experience it, and there's so many ways we have to learn how to discriminate what helps and what doesn't, especially when dealing with all of these profound issues and ecological injustices and just the whole frame of our climate emergency. Wanted to ask you about Green Faith, where it's going, especially because we've been through a lot the past few years. We had Laudato Si come out in 2015. We had the Paris Agreement, then 4 years of Trump, COVID. Now sometimes it feels like we're coming out on the other side of something, but then we're entering into an entirely different period. And it feels like the state of emergency is going to be pretty much our reality now in different phases and different contexts. As you look kind of where Green Faith has been and look ahead to the next year, but especially this next decade, and I frame this question saying, there are a lot of folks who say we only have such and such time left. I'm not entirely comfortable with that, because one, it feels also like we've in many ways ran out of time. Also, I just don't feel like countdown clocks really reflect the reality of where we're at and where we're going. I don't know if it's the most helpful frame. But as you're looking ahead to what Green Faith can provide to this movement we're in, um, how do we, how does the work of Green Faith grow into the space of being able to adapt to this emergency situation, and to be able to really give people everything they need, um, to bring in their religious communities the resiliency, the adaptation, all of these skill sets. I think of Willis Jenkins saying, this is such an unprecedented challenge and we need new creativity, and religions are really good at this. How does Green Faith help to cultivate this creativity that we need in a time of emergency, kind of looking ahead? Because I'm just trying to like look ahead, and like, you've been doing this work for many decades. I'm curious to see how you look ahead to where we're going.
I think that I know that we're entering a period of time where a lot of things have to happen at the same time.
Yeah.
We have to create a culture, politics, economy where the destruction of the planet stops. And that's got to mean that we have to have activism around no more fossil fuel infrastructure, an end to tropical deforestation, really rapid transition to 100% clean energy, sustainable food systems. We have to get the 800 million people on the planet who lack access to modern forms of energy. We've got to get them clean energy fast so that they can develop and have healthier, better educated lives with the opportunity to live at a level of material decency that any of us would want for people who we respect and hold dear. So there's that piece of the picture. There's also a massive adaptation piece of the picture, because like you said, we're beyond, the impacts are underway. So we've got to be looking at how do we start to welcome large numbers of people from regions, countries that have that are losing places that used to support large numbers of people, but they can't any longer because of droughts and floods and rising temperatures. And these tensions are going to play out at every single level. And the reason that Green Faith is putting everything we've got into creating a network of local Green Faith circles, local religiously, spiritually based climate and environmental action hubs, is because we think that the way you get cultural transformation and strength is by building that kind of local capacity, connecting it globally, defining the values that we want to be committed around together, and going to work to build that kind of future. We think about those local circles doing work in terms of helping people transform themselves, get their religious institutions operating in a stronger way, getting their and then going into public action on the campaigning level to work for systemic change. So for us, it's a simultaneous deep dive at the local level, and also having that kind of global connected perspective. So for us, what it means is really a commitment to local leadership development, building these local circles, equipping them to take action in ways that make sense for them locally. It's that old Irish saying, I think, is this a private fight or can anybody get involved? We need everybody engaged. And local organizing is an absolutely key piece to that. And not to have it be sort of two-dimensional organizing where it's just, show up and tell people what the talking points are and get them to repeat them. It's working through that kind of relational organizing process where people are, understanding what motivates them at a deep level,
Yeah.
hearing what motivates other people at a deep level, learning how to connect more with more and more people on that kind of level. And out of that, coming to and developing an understanding together of what motivates us. I mean, that sounds very involved and not necessarily direct, but in our experience, it's, building those kinds of deep relationships and bringing that kind of depth into our activism is what is really transforming.
Yeah, that's what I always appreciate about what Green Faith is doing, because it's both that the local organizing and the relational core, which I think is the more I personally do this work, the more I realize how important both of those elements are, and especially developing those local networks of resilience, just as ways of helping to us to care for each other, the ways that we need to be cared for in very immediate ways. But I also think about just there are going to be a lot of temptations, especially as the climate migration challenge increases, towards types of even totalitarian or fascist types of responses to our climate emergency. That's something that I've really wanted to include in my work, because I think you can read your Hannah Arendt and actually get a lot of understanding about where we have been and where we might be going. So these networks, these local networks of circles, these networks of anticipation, have to be the place where people can find the shelter they need and the support they need, and the places to build up the bulwark against these kinds of things. Like, we have to be very real about any study of human nature and political science over the last at least century shows things go very wrong when these pressures are increased. And
Yeah.
we have to be clear. Like, I appreciate that about just, we have to call these out and be clear about these things, and not be worried about whether people think we're too up in arms about it.
Yep. No, it's hard. I mean, none of this stuff is easy.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other, thing. I think something you just said is really important. The pressure is going to get turned up. And so we need to be ready to look at that in the eye, understand when it's happening, look at what it does to people, and deal with that with a level of compassion and human decency.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be a real challenge. And obviously already has been for a lot of people subjected to discrimination and racism and sexism and homophobia. And so it's, this is not the first time that a large number of people have had to deal with these kinds of existential threats. And what climate change is going to do is turn up those pressures across the board.
Yeah. Next time I have you on, I'd love to just specifically talk about climate migration, because it's just such again, just as we're saying, we have to talk about these things. We have to talk about what could potentially happen. As we come up to the last couple minutes here, I wanted to I have plenty of links to the Green Faith and greenfaith.org and Green Faith Fellowship on our webpage, and just anyone who searches Green Faith will find such a great website you guys have, and just so many ways for people to participate. Are there any kind of immediate actions or things that you'd like to let people know about, to be aware of, that Green Faith is going to be working on in the next few weeks and months?
So we're going to be having a regular schedule of community calls where we welcome folks in to learn more about how our community works and how we learn and grow and go into action together. We will have a regular monthly eco-theology call where we take on some of these different key public issues and look at how do we see these from a religious and moral and spiritual perspective. And we will also have quarterly organizing circle or Green Faith circle organizing trainings, so that folks can start to get to work building these local communities of activism and care and resilience. And so, folks can find out about those on our website, on our different social media feeds. And I'd, welcome folks to join us. We've got a good community, and we're growing on a global level, and it's a very enriching and good thing to be part of a community that's diverse and global,
Mhm.
and really, really wrestling with these issues.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you as always for just being part of this family and being part of this network of anticipation, which is Green Faith. And thank you, especially just for the clarity you bring to these perspectives, the experience you have. And you always, every time I have a conversation with you, always clarify things in a way that I find very, very helpful. And I just appreciate that. Appreciate the work you're doing. And I thank you for taking the time today to talk with us and help us launch this climate anticipation project.
Well, it's great to be with you, Dr. Fici, and good to see you. And thanks so much for a good conversation.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank everyone who is listening. We'll be talking with Fletcher again, hopefully soon, as one of our regular conversation partners. And check out our website and check out Green Faith for everything, ways you can participate in this great family that we have. So thank you, everybody, and we will see you soon.